Brian J. Flynn, presiding.
Thank you. Good morning. Please be seated, ladies and gentlemen. For the record, our jury has joined us back in the courtroom. Welcome back, everybody. And when we left off yesterday, Investigator Norcross was on the stand. I'll invite her to retake the stand. She's still under oath, and then Mr. Colvin, you can continue with your cross-examination whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yesterday, you were presenting a PowerPoint along with the prosecution in front of the jury. Do you recall that?
Yes.
I have made a couple of modifications to it I'd like to run through with you. Is that okay?
Okay.
Judge, permission to publish this. This is not a item I intend to introduce. It's demonstrative.
Any objection, Mr. Rubenstein?
No, Your Honor, he showed it to me previously.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you for asking.
So, there we go. So, that was the first page from your PowerPoint yesterday, is that correct?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, the monitors may not be on. We have to turn them on manually, individually, ladies and gentlemen, and we had court this morning, and Miss Olson, I think, overlooked it, so she'll turn those on for us now.
Can I help you?
We just have the one remote that we need to do. Thank you for offering, though. Thank you. We can just leave the remote up there as well in case we have some problem, like it turns off like it did yesterday or the day before. Thanks. Great, thank you. Sorry for the interruption. You can proceed whenever you're ready, Mr. Colvin.
Thank you, Judge.
You're welcome.
Now, the PowerPoint we saw yesterday that started with this, that was a PowerPoint that you had done that PowerPoint yourself along with the assistance of some other employees of the Sheriff's Department. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that PowerPoint, obviously, before you came into court yesterday to testify, you reviewed it with prosecution. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. That PowerPoint was a version of a PowerPoint that you had utilized previously during testifying during the course of this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so what we saw yesterday was like the third draft of a PowerPoint you'd worked on. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Okay. And if I understood your testimony yesterday, the purpose of that PowerPoint was to make a lot of complicated stuff more easily understandable. Is that right?
Hopefully.
Okay. And this stuff's complicated that you've been testifying about in part because when you did your job in this case, you got tons of records, right?
Correct.
I mean, you've talked about all the... You talked about all the search warrants that you did, right?
Yes.
And each one of those search warrants resulted in a bunch of documents, right?
Yes.
And out of all those documents, there's page after page after page with tons of lines of data, small print, just a bunch of stuff, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, all that stuff's in evidence, right?
Yes.
And a lot of that stuff, law enforcement really doesn't think is relevant to the prosecution of Mr. Jones. Would you agree?
I think all of it's relevant, but I think this narrows it down some.
Okay, well,
Sure.
the fact of the matter is, the phone records of Howard Bagler on June 22nd, I'm assuming, maybe I'm wrong, that he called somebody that's totally unrelated to anybody else in this case that you're aware of. That's not particularly relevant to this
To this
prosecution.
case, correct.
Okay. And so when you created this PowerPoint, what you're doing in part is taking out the stuff you, as the creator of the PowerPoint with assistance, think is irrelevant, right?
Yes, I think we narrowed it down to the day in question. A
Okay.
lot of it is the day in question of where certain people, where we know where they are.
Okay. Specifically, what we're looking at here is the list of people that are pertinent to phone calls made on June 28th, right?
Yes,
Okay, so if, and I understand you may not agree with this, okay?
okay,
But if there was something really important, relevant to the prosecution of Mr. Jones on June 26th, that's not contained in this PowerPoint, right?
not in this PowerPoint, no.
Okay. And necessarily, when you create this PowerPoint and you make selections about what goes in and out of that PowerPoint, you are making determinations on what is important for the jury to understand. Would you agree?
Yes,
Okay. Now, you don't create this PowerPoint for no reason, right? You
no,
don't do it for fun, do you?
no,
Okay. You do it because it's going to get presented to finders of fact, correct?
correct.
And necessarily, it is intended to be persuasive. Would you agree?
I think it's intended to show things simpler, is what I think it was intended for. It
Okay.
simplifies all of those records.
Well, it simplifies parts of those records.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
It simplifies the parts of the records that you, as a member of the sheriff's department, think are important for the finder of fact to see.
yes, part of it, yes.
You are not presenting facts to them that you think are relevant, right?
Correct, not in the PowerPoint, no.
Okay. So necessarily, this PowerPoint is intended to persuade them of what you believe is important in this case. Would you agree?
I think it's definitely meant to show them what is, in my opinion, important, yes.
Okay. Now, one of the things that is done when you make determinations of what goes in and out is we make a determination on how to simplify things. Would you agree?
Yes,
Okay. So for example, yesterday you talked about how you refer to the Models Inc. phone as the Models Inc. phone, right?
yes,
That's easier to call it the Models Inc. phone than to refer to it as the cell phone that is used using number 970-216, et cetera, et cetera, right?
correct.
Okay. Shorthanded, right? Models
Sure.
Inc. phone.
Sure,
Okay. You also shorthand the other phone as the personal phone, right?
correct.
Now, you know that that phone is used for business purposes, right?
Yes, I think she had a dance, some kind of a dance, some kind of business, I don't really know what that was, and a pampered chef, yes.
Okay. Well, we heard the voicemail played, right?
Yes,
And we heard the message that is left on that phone, the introductory message, if you will, right?
correct.
And it refers to brain dance, and it refers to pampered chef, and it refers to a baby sling thing, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that's also a business phone, right?
Yes, yes, it could be.
And we know that the business phone, what we're referring to as the Models Inc. phone, also relates to a business, right?
Correct?
Okay. But the Models Inc. phone is completely separate from her personal/business phone, right?
You mean the records are separate? Yes.
Okay. And they're different phone numbers, and they're different, you call one, and the other phone ain't doing anything when you call the Models Inc. phone, right?
Correct, correct.
Okay. For Models Inc. business, everything, like the cards and all that stuff, the only contact if you're trying to get a hold of Models Inc. is the Models Inc. phone, right?
Correct?
So it appears Ms. Bergfeld wants that part of her life to be separate from the rest of her life. Would you agree?
Yes.
I mean, her family calls the other phone, Mr. Beigler calls the other phone, presumably Pampered Chef people and Baby Sling people, etc., call that phone, right?
Correct?
Okay. So that phone, it makes sense, is secret given the nature of that business. Would you agree? Separate, not secret, I'm sorry.
Separate, I would agree.
Okay. And so, and you agree with me, if you're engaged in the business of being a professional escort, kind of makes sense, you'd want that to be separate from the rest of your life.
Yes.
Okay. Just like it kind of makes sense that somebody who frequents those kinds of establishments would want a separate phone. Would you agree with that?
Could be, yes, yeah.
Okay. And we, of course, know Mr. Jones purchased a track phone, right?
Yes.
All right, let's go back to this PowerPoint.
Okay.
So we've talked about how there's specific things in this PowerPoint that you believe are relevant, right?
Yes.
And you presented it in a fashion to make it easily understandable, right?
Yes.
Okay? You could have presented it in a different fashion, right?
Yes.
Okay? I'm going to show you another slide on this.
Okay.
Now, this slide here, every one of those entries is from your original PowerPoint. Does that look right to you?
Yes.
Okay. All of those entries are, in fact, times that George Corluzzo called Paige Bergfeld. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, George Corluzzo was, in fact, a suspect of the Mesa County Sheriff's Department in the disappearance and ultimately the murder of Ms. Bergfeld, correct?
Correct.
And when you lay out all the times that she called rather than break them up separately, you're showing something different than what your PowerPoint showed. Would you agree?
Is it in a different format? Yes.
Okay. Well, your PowerPoint is intended to show chronology, right?
Of all calls, correct. This is the chronology of his calls
Okay.
on that day.
And when you see this, it kind of highlights how obsessive he is about calling her. Would you agree?
Yes.
Now, when you break them up, it's not as clear. Would you agree with that? Like you did in your PowerPoint.
I think both are clear to me, sir.
Okay. Now, your PowerPoint, may I approach just?
Yes, sir, thank you.
Your PowerPoint had the purple language regarding Mr. Zotto, the yellow language regarding Motel 6, the white language regarding Mr. Beigler. That's all from your original PowerPoint. Do you agree?
Yes.
Some of this language was on your original PowerPoint, but call lasts 131 seconds indicating conversation, I added that. That wasn't in your PowerPoint, right?
Correct.
Okay. And that's in fact true, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yesterday, you spent a significant amount of time talking with the prosecution about which phone calls were voicemails and which phone calls were conversations. You recall that?
Yes.
You went through your whole PowerPoint. And I think on every single call on the PowerPoint, you talked about voicemail or conversation, right?
I believe so.
Okay. Now, the distinction between voicemail and conversation, on a few calls, you know from your experience that it's a voicemail because there's not a cell phone tower reflected, correct?
Well, and also secondarily, in her records, it indicates that direction when it goes directly to voicemail. Also, when you're talking about the direction of the call.
Right. So cell phone analysis tells you some of them had to have been a voicemail, right?
Directly to voicemail, correct.
And you just said, that's a few of the calls, right?
Oh, I think there's quite a few that day. In particular, you saw, as you saw in your previous slide, that most of Mr. Corluzzo's calls went to voicemail.
Okay. But the fact of the matter is, you and Mr. Rubenstein talked about the fact of how long a phone call would be that would result in conversation, right?
And yes, in my estimation and my experiences, yes.
Okay. And you spent a substantial amount of time yesterday making the determination just based upon the length of call, whether or not it was likely a voicemail or likely a conversation, right?
Correct, or sometimes I just can't tell.
Right.
Correct.
And credit where credit's due, when you made that distinction, you thought it was likely a voicemail, you said the word likely, right?
Yes,
But the fact of the matter is, you don't know if it in fact was a conversation or a voicemail. You're just saying it's more likely than not in your opinion, right?
yes,
So on your PowerPoint yesterday, it said voicemail, right? On many entries.
yes, if I know it went directly to voicemail.
But it also said voicemail on several where you thought it was likely based upon the length of conversation, didn't it?
I don't believe so, but
Okay.
if you want to give me an example, I can look.
Well, at any time yesterday, did you put up an entry on your PowerPoint and say, I really don't know if this is a voicemail or not? You did say you
I
couldn't
said that, I
tell.
was trying to remember which ones. And I was asked that, and some of them I don't know. Some of them, if I know, if it says to voicemail, that means it went directly to voicemail. That I know because of lack of towers and because of direction of the conversation. Those ones, I know for sure. Some of them I may not know.
Okay.
Correct.
But the fact remains that the impression your presentation gave yesterday was that many of these short calls were likely voicemails, right?
Correct.
And it's important, would you agree, to make it clear that we don't know that. That's an assumption based upon how long you think a conversation would normally take, right?
From my experiences, yes.
Okay. Well, you said yesterday that, I think the cutoff was 100 seconds, is that what you said?
Oh, no, no.
What's the cutoff?
I think 30 seconds, 30 or under is much more likely going to it rings through and goes to a voice message. Because the time starts from the time the phone gets online, for lack of better terms. That 30 seconds to 1 minute, yeah, I mean, some people leave longer messages, I don't know. Over a minute, those are usually more phone calls. That's what I was trying to relay. I hope that's what I relayed.
Okay, but here's the problem. You don't know how long it takes for any particular phone to connect to any other particular phone, right?
Correct.
That varies from phone call to phone call, cell phone to cell phone provider to cell phone provider.
Correct?
I mean, there's a lot of variables in that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And the truth of the matter is, no cell phone engineer has ever sat down and told you, yes, it will take exactly this long for this call to connect, right?
Correct.
Because those dudes don't know.
Correct.
Okay. And you just said longer than a minute indicates likely a conversation, right?
Correct.
But we know some people leave really long voicemails, right?
Correct.
So again, we're making some assumptions here, right?
Correct. That's why I said likely.
Okay. And you've said a couple of times now, you're basing this upon your expertise, right?
On my experiences in talking with people and when I review phone records, yes.
Okay. Well, your experience of length of voicemails is really no different than anybody else's. Would you agree?
Well, I would say that when we get phone records, there have been times we end up calling people and they said, well, I left a message and it's a 20-second documented time. So if they say they left a voicemail, it's 20 seconds, that makes sense to me. So if somebody says, no, I spoke with the person, but I said, hey, meet me at Fred's house, and that was it for the conversation, and they said, that's the longest conversation I had. Sometimes you can tell comparing their statements to the phone records. Sometimes you can do that. So that's my experience when I'm talking about that.
Okay. I gotta break that down for a second. Your experience with voicemails is based upon your conversations with other people, comparing them to phone records. Is that what you just told me?
Part of it, yes,
Okay.
yes. Plus how long it takes to when you make a phone call, you can sit there and, I've done it a time or two where you make the phone call to see how long it connects, just estimating. Again, I can't swear by this time or swear by that time.
Okay. You've called people before, right?
Lots of times.
Right. I mean, in your job, that's common, right?
Yes, sir.
But it's also common in like your life, right?
Yes, sir.
And you've left voicemails before, right?
Yes?
This is a common human experience, would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. The length of time that a voicemail can be left is something that pretty much everybody has experience with. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. So what you're bringing to this conversation that's different from everybody else's experience is this idea of it takes a while for the phones to connect, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that thing that you're bringing to the table that most people don't have is something that you don't know how long it really is, right?
Correct.
Okay. One of the issues for law enforcement when you're investigating a case is trying to determine a motive for the crime. Fair statement?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let's be clear. Prosecution doesn't have to prove a motive, right?
Correct.
But you as law enforcement investigating a crime, you look at motive because motive can explain how a crime happened, right?
Motive might explain how and or why. Yes.
And if you know the motive, that gives you all kinds of avenues of investigation that would lead to evidence against the suspect, right?
Yes.
So motive is an important thing to be sorting out during an investigation, when it's possible. Fair enough?
Yes.
Okay. We're talking about, on this slide, we're talking about Mr. Coraluzzo, right? Would you agree with me that when you present the phone calls of Mr. Coraluzzo in this fashion, not only does it look obsessive, but an obsession of Ms. Bergfeld could be a motive?
Yes.
In fact, law enforcement developed a theory and in fact investigated the idea that Mr. Jones had an obsession with Ms. Bergfeld. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So when you present it like this, it appears that there could be evidence of obsessive behavior by Mr. Coraluzzo, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Judge, counsel approach briefly.
Yes, sir. Feel free to stretch, everybody. Thank you. We're ready to proceed, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Colvin, you can continue whenever you're ready, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge.
Mr. Colvin, could I just have you hold off for just 1 minute?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, so we're on slide 3. This is the one up that you're looking at. Now, we had talked about the fact that this call lasts 131 seconds, indicating conversation is true. You agree with that statement, right?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. The next thing, now, remember, the previous slide arguably showed obsession on the part of Mr. Corluz. I understand reasonable people could disagree, but you did agree with me if you presented it the way I showed it, it could suggest that, right?
Yes?
This slide shows a conversation. We could then show the next slide, which would be slide 4. Slide 4 shows that after that conversation with Mr. Corluzzo, the only other things that happen is Ms. Bergfield checking her voicemail and then talking to Mr. Beigler, excuse me. That's what that slide would suggest, right?
Yes?
Now, everything on that slide is accurate and in fact from your PowerPoint, right?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Backing up to slide 3. 2013, that's a conversation with Mr. Corluzzo. There's no other phone calls with anybody that's on slide 1 between 2013 and Mr. Beigler. Would you agree?
Can I check
Sure.
something? I'm sorry, can you go back to the other slide real quick for me? Am I allowed to see?
Sure.
Thanks.
Which one? This
Yeah,
one?
that one, thank you.
Slide 3?
Yes. Correct.
Okay. So that would be a persuasive way to present these slides if you chose to. Mr. Corluzzo's obsessive, Mr. Corluzzo's talking to her at 2013. There's no other phone calls with anybody on your slide 1 except for Mr. Beigler. And looking at slide 4, we know Mr. Beigler's in Denver, right?
Correct?
Okay. That's obviously not how you presented it, right? In your PowerPoint yesterday. You didn't present it the way I've got it charted out here, did you?
I don't have the time.
What?
I don't have the minutes.
I'm not communicating with you. I'm not trying to trick you. Slide 2, 3, 4 that I just showed,
Correct?
those are different than your slides yesterday.
Yes.
And nothing I've put up is inaccurate, right?
Correct.
Okay. The presentation you did yesterday necessarily left things out. We've talked about that, right?
Correct?
I'm going to show you slide 5. Slide 5, there was actually a disagreement about this. Did your slides yesterday show the voicemail from Motel 6 to Ms. Bergfeld?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Then I stand corrected. Sorry. I couldn't find it. I'm going to show you slide 6. Your voicemail yesterday didn't show a 1332 call to a number that you determined was the CNF food store. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, we don't know if that's significant. Do you agree?
I don't know.
I mean, we don't know why she's calling CNF food store, do we?
No.
Is it possible it's relevant to this investigation?
Not that we found.
I understand you, as law enforcement, don't know a connection between the CNF food store and the disappearance of Ms. Bergfeld, right?
Correct.
Does that necessarily mean there's not one?
I think the investigation showed that there wasn't one, but I can agree. I think that we don't have any connection that I know of.
Okay.
So that wasn't in the slideshow. Correct. I would agree
Okay,
with
I
you.
don't want to get into a semantical debate with you. but
Okay.
I think this is a really important question. If law enforcement doesn't know of a connection, that does not mean there is no connection. Would you agree?
I would agree.
Okay. So just so we're clear, you don't know if that's relevant or not. What you know is law enforcement doesn't know of any relevance, correct?
Correct.
Okay. The things that you are leaving out are things that law enforcement doesn't know are relevant, correct?
Correct.
Okay. In the context of your PowerPoint yesterday, this is something you worked on with prosecution for the prosecution against Mr. Jones, right?
Correct.
So what is relevant for purposes of your PowerPoint is things that you, law enforcement, and prosecution think bolster the case against Mr. Jones.
Yes.
The way I presented the information on Mr. Coraluzzo would bolster a case against Mr. Coraluzzo, correct?
Well, I think it's the same information.
But the question was, the way I presented it would bolster a case.
I think it presents that he was calling a lot either way.
Okay. You may,
He was calling a lot.
you may disagree with me that it bolsters the case against Mr. Coraluzzo, but it certainly presents a different image than what you presented yesterday.
On an image, yes, it does.
Okay. And your presentation yesterday was the result of conscious choices made by you as law enforcement with the input of prosecution. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to show you slide 7. Continuing permission to approach. Judge?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Okay, now, on this slide, the stuff in green, stuff in orange, stuff in white, direct quote from your PowerPoint, right?
I believe so. May I double check?
Please do. If it's changed, I'm in trouble.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, yes, except for 1956. I have something here that's not.
Yeah, what I asked you about was green,
Oh,
orange, and
okay,
white.
I'm sorry. Yes, then,
Green,
yes.
orange, white, exactly the same.
Yes,
right?
yes.
I made those smaller because they're exactly the same.
Okay.
All right. Yellow is the same except for that last bullet point, right?
Correct.
The last bullet point is, that's the last call home between Ms. Bergfeld and the family, correct?
Yes, I believe so, yes.
Okay. Now, you left that off of your PowerPoint. That fact could be really important. Would you agree?
Yes.
I mean, you testified yesterday that you're familiar with the investigation, right?
Yes.
And you're certainly familiar with the chronology of the phone calls, right?
Yes.
And you're certainly familiar with the interviews with Ms. Dixon, Just Dixon, correct?
I didn't interview her, and I apologize. I don't know details about those.
Were you aware of the fact that in the last phone call with Jess Dixon, she indicated that her mother said she was on her way home, she would be there soon, and she was going straight home.
I don't know that I know that. I know she was going home after she saw I know the information from the investigation is she was going to see some clients and then she was heading home. That's what I know.
I'm going to object to that question as
Mr. Rubenstein.
that question assumes facts, not an evidence. I don't believe there was any evidence that she said she was going straight home. I think the evidence was that she was coming home soon, I believe is what Ms. Dixon, but I would ask the jury be instructed that it's their memory as to what the evidence was, not Mr. Colvin's question, assuming that.
Mr. Colburn.
Well, I disagree with prosecution. I think the testimony of Ms. Dixon did say that, but I agree with Mr. Rubenstein that obviously it's the jury's memory that controls the question.
The objection is overruled, but the jury's reminded that it's not the lawyer's memory of what the testimony is. You get to decide that as a juror. So thank you. You can proceed.
Now, I need to clarify a point.
Okay, okay.
Are you aware of any investigation indicating that Jess Dixon was told her mother was going to see some clients before she went home?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. So this last...
But I don't know the details of Jess Dixon's statement.
Got it. Understood.
Okay.
So what we know is whatever communication Ms. Bergfeld has with her child about coming home, whatever that is.
Okay.
We know that's happening at 7:56, right?
Yes.
That could be really important fact, potentially, right?
Yes.
For example, if prosecution's theory is that after that, Ms. Bergfeld's making appointments with Mr. Jones, what she's telling Jess could be a pretty big deal. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to show you another slide. Now, on this one, my understanding is you gave me...
Yes, you did. Thank you for asking. Check.
On this slide, yellow, pink, yellow, that's straight from your PowerPoint, right?
Yes.
Okay. This stuff's been added in. Now, this stuff is straight out of the phone record. Well, not straight, I typed it, but I mean, it's from the phone records, right?
Correct.
Okay. All of this stuff was left out because it wasn't relevant, or at least law enforcement didn't know the relevance. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. These data web usages, it should say usage after data web there, but that language, data web usage, is right out of the phone records, correct?
Yes.
That's how Verizon refers to those entries, correct?
Sorry. Yes.
Now, do you, from your expertise and experience, know exactly what's happening at each of those times?
No.
Okay. The fact of the matter is, phones do lots of things, and the reality is we don't always know exactly what they're doing, right?
Correct.
For example, sometimes the phone company doesn't pick up the cell phone tower number, right?
Correct.
And we don't know why.
Correct.
Just the ways of cell phones can be mysterious, I suppose, right?
I suppose.
Okay. But we know something's happening because the cell phone's tracking it, right?
Correct.
And it appears that some kind of data usage or access to the web of some type is happening. Would you agree?
Yes, those were on her 778 number.
Excellent point. Your PowerPoint yesterday refers to all phone calls made by Ms. Bergfeld, or, well, the phone calls addressing Ms. Bergfeld are all in yellow. That's your color code, right?
Yeah, yes, the brighter yellow.
Okay. Your color coding doesn't distinguish between the Models Inc. phone and the personal phone, right?
I don't believe so. No, I
Well,
don't believe so. I don't believe I I think we took them, in particular, if she was talking to people that are inclusive of this PowerPoint, I lumped that in one color, yes.
Okay, so let's back up and double check. I'm showing you slide 1. And that's straight out of your PowerPoint, right?
Correct.
So, for example, there is a pink color for Mr. Jones' personal cell phone, a blue for Mr., what law enforcement says is Mr. Jones' Walmart/track phone, right?
Correct?
Okay. So, the Walmart track phone, if in fact law enforcement's correct, and it's Mr. Jones' phone, you got 2 different colors for each of his phones, right?
I do for that, yes.
Okay. Ms. Bergfeld, 2 different phones, everything's yellow, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I gotta go forward now, back to slide 8. Okay, so these things you correctly point out, thank you. The big font red is from what you've referred to as the personal phone, correct?
Correct.
Okay. If we want to know which phone in yellow was which phone, then we got to go back and look at the records, right? Or have you tell us today, I suppose.
Correct?
Okay. Now, this phone call at 1901, you indicated yesterday this is a phone call with an unknown person, right? By unknown number, we mean you didn't know who it was, right?
Correct.
Okay. But based on the time, it indicated a conversation, right?
Yes.
Okay. You've been investigating this case since when?
I was initially on it in 2007. I was on it for a period of time, and I've done intermittent work since then, some.
Okay. You were in fact, weren't you actually at a briefing on July 2nd? Is that right?
Yes?
Okay.
Yes?
July 2nd of 2007.
Correct.
So, and obviously, this is work for you. I'm not saying you're not liking it, but you're working right now, right?
Yes.
Okay. So off and on, you've worked this case from July 2nd, 2007 till today's date in 2016, right?
Correct.
Last night after you testified, you, along with Investigator Heavenstreet, along with prosecution in this case, you all were trying to find out whose phone number that was at 1901. Is that correct?
Correct. Initially, I identified a bunch of them, and then the decision was made that I wasn't going to identify all 2,000 phone calls, and I know other people identified stuff later, and that was one that was not.
Okay. We're going to talk about unidentified phone numbers in a second.
Okay.
I want to talk about this
Okay.
one in particular.
Okay.
This one in particular. Sorry, Jim. Not at all. This phone call in particular, we are, what, 9.5 years later, right?
Yes.
9.5 years later, and law enforcement and prosecution are still trying to sort out exactly who's calling who on all these records. Fair enough?
On some of them, yeah.
Okay. Back in 2007, you were an investigator just like now, right?
Correct.
And in 2007, you are assigned to this case, right?
Yes.
Along with a whole bunch of other investigators at the Sheriff's Department, right?
Yes.
Big case, lots of resources going into it.
Yes.
And you're one of the resources that they put into it.
Yes, sir.
Big cases have a lead investigator, right?
Correct.
And the lead investigator, when you're first assigned to this case, is Investigator Jarrell, correct?
Correct.
Investigator Jarrell, as a lead investigator, is the person who, though she reports to superiors in the chain of command, she's the one that's responsible for kind of keeping track of the whole ongoing information flow in and direction of the case. Fair enough?
Yes.
Okay. Even though this started in 2007, the phone calls, the relevant phone calls were only in 2007. That was the determination law enforcement made, right?
Yes,
In other words, you guys didn't try and get phone call records from 2006.
correct.
Okay. And the phone calls were your bailiwick, right?
For the most part, yes.
At least in the beginning.
Yes,
Okay. So the investigator Gerald's the lead. You're the person who's handling getting the records, reviewing the records, generating all the reports about the records, right?
for the most part, yes.
Okay. Now, you said you've worked on the case off and on throughout the duration of the case, right?
Yes,
Okay. You're aware that, well, you've testified previously in this case, right?
correct.
And in fact, you've testified as a cell phone expert in this case, is that correct?
Yes,
And you've testified previously as a cell phone expert in other cases in Mason County, right?
I think once. Yes, once or twice.
Okay. And you know that after the last hearing where you testified, there was a break of time until this trial, right?
Correct?
Okay. Are you aware that in that intervening space, that a FBI agent was brought in to work with the cell phone records?
Yes, I am.
Okay. In no case that you've worked on in your career being a specialist for the Mason County Sheriff's Department in cell phones, have they brought in FBI experts, is that right? In cell phones.
To testify? I've talked to some of them in the past about other cases, not this case. Are you talking about to testify, sir?
Right.
I don't know that answer. I haven't had that happen, but I don't know if they've ever brought one.
Was your work in this case reviewed by the FBI agent?
Concerning that some of the tower coverage, yes.
Okay. And to your knowledge, did they find any errors in your work?
Sir, I don't know if they reviewed all of my work. I don't know that answer.
Okay, but that wasn't the question I asked you. To your knowledge, did they find any errors in your work?
I don't know that they were reviewing my work like you're saying. I know they came in to get us some tower coverage information to try to figure out coverage stuff, which is a little bit different. I know I have towers, but I didn't have exact coverage locations.
Okay.
So I don't know how to answer that question.
I think we're talking past each other.
Okay.
Did anybody specifically, not anybody, take that out. Did an FBI expert brought into this case recently tell you you made any mistake?
No, they have not.
Okay. So, to your knowledge, you haven't made any mistakes on this case related to the cell phone records, period. End of question.
Correct?
Okay. Now we're going to talk about something different, okay?
Okay.
All right. You talked yesterday about how there's different kinds of orders you can seek out. There's emergent orders, search warrants, court orders, right?
Correct?
You're familiar with all those things. You know how to do them. In fact, you do them all the time, right?
Correct?
There's also something you can do called a letter of preservation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, a letter of preservation is a letter that's generated by law enforcement and sent to cell phone companies, correct?
Correct?
And the entire point of a letter of preservation is it just puts a hold on all the records so nothing gets destroyed. Is that right?
Correct?
Now, the way records work for a cell phone company is they save stuff for a period of time, right?
Correct?
And different cell phone companies save it for different periods of time, right?
Yes?
And you told us yesterday that length of time changes, right?
Yes?
But all of them are going to destroy them at some point, right?
Correct?
And so it's like this it's like this constantly moving little time frame where the records are getting chewed up at the back end and getting generated at the front end, right?
Correct.
And when you put that letter of preservation out, it slows that train down so they don't get chewed up as fast, right?
Correct.
Now, you've testified previously, no letters of preservation were generated in this case, correct?
Correct.
And no letters of preservation were generated in this case by you because you go to that initial briefing on July 2nd and you're going to go out and get those records right then, right?
I got records over a period of time, yes.
But you testified previously, the reason you didn't do letters of preservation was because it was your intention to just go get the records. There was no purpose in the letter
Right.
of preservation.
I didn't get them all in one day. I don't know that I can physically do that. But I got them over a period of time. I knew I would be getting them within a short period of time, or at least requesting them.
Okay. And the fact of the matter is, at this point, there are records that you don't have, right?
Correct.
In fact, there were records that other investigators tried to get, right?
Yes?
In 2013, Investigator Hebenstreet was going out trying to get a bunch of records, right?
Yes?
Okay. Now, those records, you never did any letters of preservation on, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, in fairness to you, you didn't know about all the records back in 2007 that potentially would have been helpful in this case, right?
Correct.
But what you did know in 2007 was that you had cell phone records for Ms. Bergfeld's phones, right?
Yes?
And you had cell phone records for Mr. Jones' phones, right?
Yes?
And you knew in 2007 you had a bunch of phone numbers that you didn't know who they belonged to, right?
Correct.
And with a phone number, you can do a letter of preservation, right?
Yes? Yes?
Okay. So it is possible back in 2007, you could have slowed down that train chewing up those records, right?
If you can figure out who the phone company is, which generally you can, yes. Yes.
Okay. Excellent point. The reality is, the phone number doesn't always tell you, well, it doesn't tell you what the phone company is, but there's only a finite number of phone companies. Would you agree?
Yes. Generally, yes. There's some smaller companies, but yes.
And frankly, if you threw out 4 or 5 letters of preservation, you're going to hook up probably what, 85% of the phone calls out there? If you hit Quest, Verizon, AT&T, Cricket, and Mobile.
Oh, you're saying just send a letter to them not knowing whether the number belongs to them? And just send it out? Yes, I guess you could.
All right. So even if you didn't know the company, it would take you the time to write a letter of preservation, which comes on a form, right?
Correct.
Fill in the blank, right?
Yes?
You might have to cut and paste it to put in Verizon instead of AT&T and stuff. But we're just talking about simple inserting things in the blank, right?
Correct.
And if you put those out there, you probably pick up most of the phone calls, even if you don't pick them up all, right?
Possibly, yes.
Okay. But what you did do is you went out and did search warrants right away, correct?
The court orders, yes.
Yes. Sorry. And you did that because it was important to get records. That was your job, right?
Part of it, yes.
Okay. And so you went out and you got all the records that you thought were important early on or that people told you were important early on, right?
Correct?
Now, I'm going to show you slide 9. This is the chart that we had at the very beginning, the very first page, but I've added something to it, right?
Correct?
Okay, so you go to this briefing on July 2nd, right?
Correct.
That's the very first day you were involved in this case, correct?
Correct.
And on that day, the day of the briefing, your first day on the case, you're requesting records for Ms. Bergfeld, right?
Correct.
Very logical place to start. The lady's missing, let's find out what's on her records, right?
I would agree.
And in fact, before this date, they'd already done the emergent records request, correct?
They had, yes.
Okay. But you're doing a more complete request to get more records, right?
Correct?
The next thing that's ordered on this case is Mr. Coraluzzo's records, right?
Correct?
So he's the first person beyond Ms. Bergfeld that you, in your capacity as a cell phone person, are looking at, correct?
Correct?
All right. Next thing that happens is you're ordering records on Mr. Jones and that track phone, right?
Correct?
So he's the second person that you, in your capacity as a cell phone expert, have identified as important, right?
Or was identified by somebody, yes.
Okay. Now, these determinations on these records are coming off of the phone calls that are being made to Ms. Bergfeld's phone in the records that you've obtained. Is that correct?
Along with interview information that's coming at the time.
Okay. The next thing that happens after that is Mr. Beigler.
Right?
Now, that's over a month later before those records are requested, correct?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Beigler was known to be the last person who had been with Ms. Bergfeld on July 2nd when you're at that briefing, right?
Correct. Right?
In fact, he was known to be the last person to be in contact with Ms. Bergfeld before that briefing, right?
Yes.
I mean, he told law enforcement that when he called them.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. The last person to have been with somebody, probably pretty important person to get the records on, right?
Right?
You did, right?
Right?
But a month after things have started, right?
I was gone for a section of time in there on a vacation, but yes, it was after the vacation.
Now, I'm not trying to blame you for taking a vacation. But you are not the only person at the Mesa County Sheriff's Department that knows how to request records.
At the time, I was the only one in investigations that did them, actually.
Yesterday, you said there was one or two.
There was a gentleman who worked up at the task force, and actually I don't know exactly what date he started pulling them. I learned later that he was doing them up there.
Okay. So, is it your testimony that if Mesa County Sheriff's Department in 2007 needs cell phone records to try and find a missing person and you're on vacation, well, we'll get to it once she gets off of her time off?
We got to it once I got to my time off. Correct, that's what happened, yes.
Okay. The next thing that happens is Mrs. Jones' records, right?
Yes,
The next thing that happens, whoop. Too quick on the trigger. Mr. Dixon's records. We're
Correct.
in August, right?
correct,
Okay. Mr. Dixon's the ex-husband. Logical. Check
Correct.
him out, right?
correct. I knew we had information about him being confirmed in Pennsylvania before that, but yes, we got them.
Okay. Now, you can't get records on Mr. Zotto and Motel 6, right?
Correct,
And that's because they're house phones, and you talked about that, right?
correct,
Now, everybody here is associated with June 28th. That was the point of your PowerPoint, right?
yes,
In June 28th, you, in your capacity as law enforcement and in conjunction with prosecution, determined the entire point of this PowerPoint was to focus on simplifying information that was relevant to the determination this jury has to make, right?
correct,
And June 28th is the day you wanted to talk about because that's what is helpful in this case, right?
correct,
And the next thing that happens in this case is Mr. Caruth, well, not the next thing on this chart. Mr. Caruth, his records don't get obtained until July of 2013. Isn't that right?
correct.
How long ago did you know Mr. Caruth was on the phone with Ms. Bergfeld in 2007?
I personally didn't know anything about him for a long period of time.
Okay. but his phone number was on those records.
Yes, I'm sure his phone number was there.
And that phone number had been there from the day you got these records.
Correct, correct.
And you got everybody else's records that you could identify, right?
Yes. And
Mis-
yes, that I could identify or that I was asked to get, yes.
And Mr. Caruth was ultimately able to be identified, right?
Correct.
But the reality is, it's 6 years, 7 years.
Correct?
No, 6 years. Our math's off.
Yes, 6.
6 years later.
Correct.
Before we're running down records.
Correct. Yeah, I personally wasn't involved with his investigative part, so I didn't really know
Okay.
anything about him.
But the reality is, 6 years
Somebody
to
did.
get Mr. Caruth's records ain't bad if you compare it to the fact last night you guys were looking for one of these unknown numbers, right?
Correct?
Okay. Okay. I'm going to show you. Can I have a second to consult with counsel?
Yes, sir, thank you.
This would be a great breaking point if you were so inclined. I can proceed if you'd rather.
Sounds great to me. Thank you. We'll go ahead and take our morning recess, ladies and gentlemen. Please remember the instructions for the recesses. We'll just take a short break like usual. Thank you so much. Please rise for our jury. Our jury's left the courtroom just about 10 minutes, investigator.
Okay.
If you'll be back then, thank you. Anything else for the record, Mr. Rubenstein?
No, sir.
Mr. Colvin? All right, we did upload those things that Mr. Rubenstein had emailed to me, just so you all know, if you'll take a look at them, see if there's any objection. Otherwise, the record will just reflect that the documents that we just uploaded this morning with regard to a PDF of the PowerPoint, and then they're the singular records of the items we discussed at the bench that Mr. Rubenstein was going to email to me and upload. So, thank you. We're in recess.